Great, thanks everyone. It's quite strange not to be able to see you all. Anyhow, good morning and thank you very much to CANZ for inviting me to speak here today. I'll just get my slides to work. There we go. So in the first part of my talk today, I would like to discuss how we can provide a good life for animals by pivoting the traditional shelter model to keep animals out of the shelter system. Unfortunately, even the best designed shelter is an inherently stressful environment for animals. There are strange noises, strange smells, strange people, strange animals, new unpredictable routines, exposure to disease, as Helen mentioned, unfamiliar food, changes in the thermal environment, frequent handling, and separation from familiar people. And all of these factors contribute to significant stress and mean that taking animals into shelter care is not the best outcome for every animal. So in discussing what a good life in the shelter looks like, it would be remiss of me not to discuss the fundamental shift that is occurring, where shelters are prioritising the provision of services to keep people and animals together and to keep animals within communities. In saying that, shelters will always be there at the bottom of the cliff, but there are many ways we can prevent animals from getting to this point. Poverty, short-term emergencies, illness, lack of affordable, accessible vet care and behaviour support, and a shortage of animal-friendly housing can result in even the most devoted owner giving up their animal. I'm sure some animals want to give up their owners too. Where an animal already has a loving home, it is most often in the best interest of both the person and the animal that short-term support is provided to keep them in the home, rather than surrendering them to the shelter. The majority of people surrendering animals do not make the decision lightly, and 75% of people surrendering do so due to a lack of accessible resources or a lack of animal accessible housing. When they're made aware of support options, many people choose to explore these options to support them keeping their animal. Shelters are beginning to shift away from a rescue way of thinking, away from the idea that they're saving the animal by bringing them into the shelter, only to rehome them. Instead, shelters are considering what the best outcome is for each individual animal, then providing for the animal to achieve that outcome. This includes providing support to help prevent surrender to the shelter. In this new model, the community becomes the heart of the shelter. The physical shelter becomes a community centre and retains the ability to provide emergency care for those animals that do need it, but it increases the provision of community support services and it acts as a safety net for people and pets together. In this model, surrender becomes the last resort option. Short-term support is provided to keep animals within their homes, and foster becomes the preferred way of housing animals. This approach creates more effective long-term human behaviour change to solve the cause of the issue, rather than simply removing and rehoming the animals. It has the potential to cut the number of animals coming into the shelter by half and reduce the number of days an animal is in the shelter by 50% or more. This slide might be a little hard for you to read, so just bear with me. This is an example flowchart that I sketched up using SPCA as an example, and it outlines the numerous support services that could be developed to support an owner who is considering surrender. The yellow arrow at the top shows the potential surrender point, and then the yellow arrow at the bottom shows the potential intake into the shelter after these other options are explored. The two orange bubbles represent how support services could be accessed, either in a self-service manner or through guided pre-surrender counselling. Similar services can also be provided for found and stray animals, and I'll talk more about that later on. But in the next few slides, I just want to briefly touch on some of the support services that could be considered. Shelters aspire to be the first place people turn to when they need help for their animals. Establishing a community support portal is one way that shelters can gather together trusted evidence-based community support resources that support owners to keep their animals. Community portals need to include combined human and animal supports. These portals can be self-navigated, or shelter staff can support owners to navigate the resources via pre-surrender counselling. Shelters can use pre-surrender counselling to assess a person's situation, and if they wish to keep their animal, and it's in the animal's best interest to stay with the person, to then triage the person to the most appropriate support for their situation. There are many services that can be provided to assist in resolving issues that often lead to surrender. And some of these that I'll talk about include short-term care supplies, support with behaviour problems, preventative health and vet support, short-term housing, and rehoming support. Short-term financial issues are one of the leading causes of surrenders to shelters. Many shelters operate a type of pet pantry to provide short-term pet care supplies. These most often provide food, but can also include litter, flea and worm supplies, bedding, and suitable housing. Additional funds can also be established, such as a Stay Together Fund. This can be used for creative solutions to support animals staying in homes, such as fence building and catio building, or to help with subsidised veterinary costs. Behaviour problems are one of the leading causes of surrenders. Owners often don't pursue behavioural support due to a perceived lack of information about the availability and efficacy of these interventions. Providing behavioural support to address behaviour issues prior to surrender is a cost-effective, community-focused solution that can help animals avoid entering the shelter system. We also know that the majority of animal owners are unable to afford and access vet care for their animals at some point in their lives. 80% of people cannot afford an unexpected vet bill, and a further 10% struggle to afford basic vet care. Cost and transport are both barriers to essential preventative care, such as desexing, microchipping, and vaccination. It is better for animal welfare and often more cost-effective to provide short-term, reduced or fee-waived basic vet care. To overcome access barriers, shelters need to bring support into communities rather than expecting the community to come to the shelter. And desexing, of course, must be a priority to prevent unwanted offspring that feed back into the shelter cycle. Many services can be established or supported by the shelter and can assist people in obtaining veterinary care for their animal. These can include things such as low-cost desexing programs, drive-through vaccination and microchipping clinics, mobile vet clinics, transportation services to get animals to and from appointments, and interest-free loan programs. Oops, I've gone the wrong way there. Restrictions on rental properties and retirement villages are another leading cause of animal surrender. Changing living situations and work requirements are also often cited as reasons for animal surrender. Shelters can offer support by providing referral options for supportive human services and affordable pet-friendly housing options, access to downloadable pet CV templates. Shelters can advocate for pet-friendly public transport and pet-friendly workplaces, and partner with emergency boarding providers. Foster programs can also be used to support animals to complete their stray hold or their quarantine time and wait for their new home outside of the shelter. Supporting animals while they remain in the community results in greater capacity to help those truly vulnerable animals within the shelter. Increased utilisation of foster reduces the time an animal spends in the shelter, as well as in shelter costs. It also increases the capacity available within the shelter for those animals that need to be there. It prevents incoming animals from introducing disease to the shelter or becoming sick as a result of being in the shelter. Finder foster programs support people to foster animals they find on a short-term basis until the owner is found or until there is space available in the shelter. Keeping animals in the community where they are found increases their chance of being reunited with their family. When pets stay in the community, the likelihood of being reunited jumps to 86%. Adoption from foster is another mechanism shelters can use to keep animals in the community. COVID-19 has seen many shelters move to a 100% foster model, where all animals were moved out of the shelter to foster homes and adopted remotely via online profiles. Many shelters, including those here in New Zealand, have moved to a modified version of this, where a high reliance on foster homes remains and shelters are closed to public viewing of adoptable animals, instead favouring an online viewing approach with trial adoption programs. Shelters can also support community rehoming. They can develop and offer services to facilitate and support community rehoming to avoid animals entering the shelter. This can include providing advertising portals, the provision of templates and advice guides, and offering services such as vaccination, desexing, and health checks to make sure animals are ready to go to their new homes. This can provide people who need it with the resources to safely rehome their animals. The community shelter model allows shelters to focus on animals most in need. The shelter remains the best place for those animals requiring urgent and specialised medical or behaviour care. But by pivoting the model and prioritising the provision of services that help keep people and animals together and keep animals within communities, shelter resources are freed up and can be redirected towards essential preventative work, for example, desexing programs. For some animals, sheltering is the best outcome. So how can we provide a good life for animals in the shelter, given the inherent stress associated with the shelter environment? Stress is the single greatest risk factor for illness and behavioural problems in the shelter. which in turn acts to increase the animal's length of stay and reduces their chance of successful adoption. The good news is that all elements of the shelter environment, from the point of intake to the outcome, can be designed to minimise stress. Because I don't have a lot of time in this presentation, I'm briefly going to touch on 3 key aspects: capacity management, housing design, and human interaction. Proactive capacity management, that is understanding capacity limits and not exceeding them, is a fundamental mechanism for minimising animal stress in the shelter. This sounds like a simple concept, but the reality is that often this isn't achieved as more and more animals arrive at the shelter doorstep and more temporary cages are set up. When a shelter operates over capacity, the average length of stay of each animal increases. And this is significant because increased length of stay is directly associated with increased risk of disease and decreased chance of adoption. So how can length of stay be minimised? Minimising length of stay really begins at intake. Pathway plans should be established for different categories of animals, such as young adoptable animals that are likely to fast-track their way through the shelter versus older animals that may require behaviour support. The appropriate pathway plan for the animal should be selected at intake. Animals can diverge from their pathway if the need arises, but all animals should start down a decided pathway at intake. This should include scheduling future appointments for follow-up vaccinations, desexing surgeries, behaviour assessments, and approval for adoption health checks. Scheduling these appointments helps prevent unnecessary delays as the animal progresses through the shelter. Daily shelter rounds should also be performed to ensure that each animal each day receives what they need to move as safely and efficiently as possible through the shelter. Shelter rounds not only include behaviour and medical support, but also logistical needs assessment to move the animal through the shelter stay. To simplify this, there are 5 key questions to ask of each animal each day. Who are you? How are you? Are you where you need to be? Do you need something today? Do you need something scheduled? Asking these questions of each animal each day helps keep each animal moving on their pathway through the shelter. Shelter housing also has a significant impact on length of stay. Appropriate housing design is housing that meets the animal's needs. Here I'm using cats as an example. Their needs have and continue to be greatly overlooked in the shelter environment. For cats, inclusion of the following elements, as seen in this sketch, can support stress reduction in the shelter. Double compartment caging design. This provides separation between resting and eating areas and the litter box. Addition of height, for example, a raised resting space. Cats need elevation and room to stretch upwards. A soft resting space. A normal size litter box. The cage needs to fit a normal litter tray and allow for normal posturing behaviour. Space. Cats need enough room to be able to lie on their side without touching food bowls or litter trays. Barred cage fronts are recommended to support ventilation and human interaction, and a place to hide should be given at all times so they can choose to remove themselves from view. They also need the provision of something to scratch, and cages should be designed to minimise noise, for example by using quiet hinges or latches. When we think about cat behaviour and what cats need, the list I've just mentioned seems quite obvious, yet we still tend to see cats like those in the image on the left, with no place to hide and not enough room to meet their needs. So the 2 biggest differences that we can make to traditional cat housing in the shelter is the conversion to double compartment and the provision of a place to hide. Portals offer a cost-effective way to transform cat housing from single cages to double-sided cages, and this separates the eating and sleeping area from the toileting area. Portals can be purchased off the shelf or they can be homemade. In addition to the extra space, portals also allow easy cleaning without having to remove the cat from the cage by shutting them off to one side. Portals can be added top to bottom rather than side to side, or you can have both. Cats should also be provided with appropriate places to hide, which comfortably allow them to avoid visual contact with people or other animals. These images show a hide, perch and go, which is a type of box that provides a resting space on the top, and converts to a carry cage. These types of boxes are ideal because they can be moved throughout the shelter with the cat, and they can even go home with the cat to ease the transition into their new environment. But really, any old box will suffice. Just some place to hide is what a cat needs. A curtain can also be used, and it can cover part of the cage to increase the cat's sense of security. The previous cage examples are really only sufficient for a short stay of 1 to 2 weeks max. Unfortunately, due to illness or behaviour issues, many cats in the shelter have a much longer stay. In Europe, there has been a shift away from using cages towards using individual pens. In other parts of the world, including here in New Zealand, we tend to see this type of housing used only in adoptions, where public perception is considered important. In Europe, the benefits of this larger housing for cats is recognised, and individual pen housing is being used in all areas of the shelter, including in quarantine and isolation zones. Any shelters that are looking to upgrade their cat housing should consider incorporating individual cat pens in areas of the facility that house cats for longer than 1 to 2 days. And before I finish up, I would like to briefly mention the relationship between human interaction and stress in cats in the shelter environment. For some cats, interaction with an unknown human is stressful, particularly when they are in a shelter environment. Progressive shelters have handling rules and guidelines in place, not only for disease control, but also to minimise stress. And these tend to focus on the following main points. Minimal interaction in the first 48 hours. This allows time for the cat to settle into their shelter environment, and staff do not interact more than absolutely necessary during this time. Spot cleaning of cages for the duration of the cat's stay, unless of course they're heavily soiled. This has important benefits for allowing the cat to retain its own smell, providing a sense of security. No more than 2 moves between cages in the first week. Movement between cages in the shelter is incredibly stressful for cats and often results in the occurrence of disease or a relapse of disease. Reducing movement can be achieved by rethinking housing design. Ensuring a consistent routine every day, ideally with the same carer. This provides predictability to the cat, which increases their feelings of security. Wherever possible, staff and volunteers should avoid picking up cats. And shelters should develop interaction SOPs that prioritise allowing the cat to maintain the choice to interact with the human carer. So in summary, where it's best for the person and the animal, shelters should engage support services to keep animals at home. For animals that do need to come into the shelter, and there will always be those that need to, 3 key areas for improving their experience are clear pathway planning, species-specific housing. For cats, this should include separate eating, sleeping spaces and toileting spaces, and places to hide, and well-developed human interaction guidelines. And for cats, this should maximise the cat's choice of whether to interact or not. And that's me. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Yep, that's all. Yep, that's great. Thanks, Jess. That's awesome. Thank you very much for that presentation. Yeah, some really interesting things there. I really enjoyed your rounds question thing. The 5 questions to ask every animal in the centre is a really nice idea. So having worked as a shelter veterinarian for SPCA at one point in time, we did stand in front of each cage and have a conversation, but it wasn't actually a structured thing, and I could see that the benefits of actually using that tool to expedite their journey through would be really, really useful. Great. So we do have a question here from Molly, who has asked, is there a way that behavioural specialists, and she has put in brackets that's feline in her particular instance, can offer services to the SPCA to help reduce surrender rates? Which is a very generous offer, and I'm sure the answer will be yes.
It's a very generous offer, yes, and yes, and we will already do have some specialists within our operations team that focus on some of these aspects. But yeah, absolutely, we're always open to services, and yeah, just reach out. Answer to that one.
Yep, great. So Molly, I'm sure you've picked that up, but of course those details are all available online. And if you have any trouble finding that, then do reach out to CANZ and we can help with that too. But I'm very sure SPCA has a number of ways to make contact online.